In the last 10 years or so, there's been a boom in films based on reimagined fairy tales. Disney is largely responsible, revisiting their copyrighted and sanitized versions of stories with live-action actors, and proving to other studios that, yes, there is a market for blandly transgressive retellings of well-trod tales. Time and again, people are paying to see these fairy tales, but critical reception has been meh. But while Disney is confined by the family-friendly values and techniques of the brand, other production companies are not.
My name is Gretel, and this is my brother Hansel.
We learned a couple of things while trapped in that house. One, never walk into a house made of candy. And two, if you're gonna kill a witch, set her ass on fire.
Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters was silly. The premise essentially being, what if we took Hansel and Gretel and gave them a bunch of guns? What if it was really violent and gory, but like, in a badass way? What if we made them swear and stuff? Wouldn't that be so rock and roll? And yeah, fine, I'm not here to bash a goofy action movie. When it comes down to it, the premise just doesn't have enough there to merit discussion. To be good, a new remake of a traditional story needs to not only interpret it in a new way, but also make use of that folktale framework to have something to say. So, in comes 2020's Gretel and Hansel.
I'm called Gretel, and this rough one here is my brother Hansel.
Ouch! The film opens by telling us explicitly it has a lesson to teach.
So children, please, beware of gifts.
So what gifts are being given? And what is their underlying threat? To understand how Gretel and Hansel shifts from its source material, let's first look to the original fairy tale. Hansel and Gretel was published by the Brothers Grimm in 1812, having been recorded from existing folk tales. In the story, the children are abandoned by their parents in the woods due to the scarcity of food at home, only to be lured by a witch offering abundance in the form of a gingerbread house.
It's a house made of candy!
The witch captures the children, using Gretel as a servant and fattening up Hansel to eat.
Gretel! Come here! There's work to be done! Work, work, work! She's horrible. I hate her. Cooking and killing and cooking. Oh, it's a lovely life.
To free them both, Gretel must push the witch into her own fire, burning her alive. She and Hansel are then able to return home, carrying with them riches they have stolen from the witch's house to buy food for the parents who left them. Scholars have argued this story may have developed from a historic famine in 14th century Europe, during which time it was recorded that mothers abandoned, or even ate, their children. This problem of scarcity is present in so many historic fairy tales, but is it still relevant in the same way today?
Tell me the fairy tale again.
It's too scary, start seeing things that aren't there.
The film works from the traditional premise, but changes aspects of the narrative, focusing more on feminine power. After all, Gretel is the child who saves them in the original story. There are a number of other new elements introduced in this movie. I won't get into the child with the pink cap because, frankly, it's weird and complicated and I'm just not that interested. One of the major themes of Gretel and Hansel is the price of power and knowledge. The power of the witch, and as we learn, the power latent in Gretel, is not free. The gift of magic is largely demonstrated to us through the motif of feasting. Unlike the traditional fairy tale, this witch does not live in the iconic gingerbread house. But though the cottage itself isn't edible, the children are still lured by the smells coming from the food inside, prompting Hansel to break in, giving the film a plot more like Goldilocks. In making this choice, director Oz Perkins is able to circumnavigate the problem an edible house presents. It is inherently unsustainable. Eating the house destroys it. Without the intervention of the witch, the children would be left once again both without food or shelter. Though the children discuss cake, sweet foods are not the focus of their feasting. Inside the cottage, beautiful and bountiful spreads of food are laid out for the hungry children, and because they're starving, they eat. However, Gretel is quick to offer their help as payment, not willing to accept this bounty as pure charity. She understands from the beginning that this blessing must have a cost. We just don't yet know what that cost is. The problem of forbidden fruit is built into Western storytelling with the story of Eve and the apple. In Genesis, God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where they have everything they could want to eat. But God tells them they must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or they will die. But Satan, as the serpent, tells Eve she should just go for it, and so she does.
No, I'm eating these apples. They're so delicious.
No, big man upstairs said, no, go.
God said we can't do this?
I think so.
Well, I mean, it's just tasty apples. Why couldn't we be able to do this?
Sin.
Have one for yourself, friend.
What? I don't know, Eve.
What if I told you it was tasty? Oh, no.
For the sin of eating the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden and cursed to labor for their food forever. So we have this connection between food and knowledge, and we also have a strong argument for the potential power of food. As such a key element in the Christian creation story, food is made holy. Being the descendants of this generational curse to toil for food, there is an understanding that it has been demanded by God that food must be worked for. In repenting for Eve's sin in the garden, we are no longer allowed to receive food without giving something in return. The image of the forbidden fruit is so potent that we see it repeated in other fairy tales, arriving in the form of Snow White's poisoned apple, offered by a hag queen not unlike the witch of Hansel and Gretel. In European folklore traditions, the fairies often offer up a magical feast to mortals who stumble into their world. Children are warned to practice restraint, as eating fairy food could mean they become trapped in the fairy realm forever. As we will see in later representations of magical eating, food is tightly tied to its origins. In other tales, people wake up after their dealings with the fairies, only to find that the feast they thought they were enjoying was just soil and leaves, made to appear delicious by fairy glamour. In either version, the message is the same: be wary of gifts freely given, for they may not be the blessing they appear. As we can see in the architecture of the cottage itself, Gretel and Hansel does not confine itself to connecting with motifs of the ancient past. We can see clear allusions to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, itself another story heavily reliant on the power of food, and not just as sustenance.
What did it say?
Strange as it might be, I think she said, "Eat me."
Food is a vessel by which one may pass from one way of being to the next. The transformational effects of magical mushrooms give these main characters new perspectives when they are in a rut, and the acceptance of food given to them by the gatekeepers of these strange realms is necessary to uncovering deeper levels of meaning. Food is often connected to a doorway or a path to the unknown. Pan's Labyrinth, another modern fairy tale, though one less connected to particular existing source material, also referenced Alice. In Pan's Labyrinth, we are once again shown the dangers of magical feasts and not heeding the warnings to abstain. The food laid out at the table of the Pale Man is designed to be as enticing as possible, and the pleasure of eating the forbidden fruit can have fatal consequences. It seems that for children especially, practicing self-control in the face of such a feast is almost impossible. Children, after all, are generally not in control of the food they eat. It is given to them by adults and shared with others. So for a child, the excitement of food is all the more because of the rarity of its plentifulness. In the Harry Potter series, new students at Hogwarts are welcomed into a magical world with an appropriately magical feast, appearing before them out of thin air. This is some of the first magic they experience, and it is part of the process of their indoctrination into this alternate realm. As Harry and his friends age, however, they learn that the feasting they enjoy is the result of the labor of house elves in the Hogwarts kitchens. So while it is still kind of a magic, the characters are presented with an ethical question, one that most of us will grapple with at some point. Where does my food come from? And more specifically, does the seemingly magical nature of its materialization point to potentially problematic origins? In the sci-fi fairy tale The Matrix, the pleasures of the artificial experience of the simulation come at the cost of human enslavement and sustenance through liquefaction.
I know this steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is juicy and delicious.
The glamour of the steak is only in the mind, while the sustenance fueling the body of those inside the fairy world of the Matrix is in fact human remains. Like Eve eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge, once people learn the nature of the Matrix, they generally don't return to their previous easy state of unknowing.
Ignorance is bliss.
Though technically a utilitarian recycling of corpses, effectively, we are confronted with the viscerally uncomfortable taboo of cannibalism. Cannibalism is big in fairy tales. It plays on a number of anxieties, both concrete and psychological. Folklore scholars connect the fear of being eaten with the fear of losing the self. Children's fears of being eaten by their parents is natural. Their survival is always dependent on the care of adults, and the withdrawal of care can be as deadly as consumption. Coraline director Henry Selick described his film as a combination of Alice in Wonderland and Hansel and Gretel. In the traditional Hansel and Gretel tale, their mother, or stepmother, is the one who calls for their abandonment, and is sometimes considered to be an alter ego of the witch. When the children kill the witch, threatening to eat them, they return home to find that their mother too has died. This dual nature of the mother/witch as a potential threat is tied to the dangers of good food as a lure. We are warned of the pleasures of food, this weakness we all share, and that we fear may be exploited, ultimately resulting in our demise. Gretel has a nightmare in which she is in the witch's secret cellar uncovering corpses. She wakes to find that she started her period, and she has entered womanhood, signaling new knowledge and maturity, and realizing her own capacity to produce blood. This is where she really starts noticing the underlying horror of her surroundings, and her doubts truly begin.
Were the dreams I was having only the result of too much rich food before bed? Or were they a message? A warning? And was I now missing a chance to listen to myself?
She expresses these fears to Hansel.
There's something wrong here.
But it's so pleasant.
But tell me what hides behind that pleasantness. There are things here. Bad things.
What bad things?
The abundance, for one.
What's that mean?
It means too much. There's too much, and it isn't right. Where are the animals? From where does she draw milk? From where does she conjure up her endless parade of cakes?
She also confronts the witch.
Plums only keep for 3 days out of season. And that ham is unsalted. It must be going bad.
And yet it isn't.
The impossibility of the feast the children are being presented with must be spelled out for a 21st century audience. Through greenhouses, refrigeration, and global food markets, we are so used to all foods being available at all times that we may not immediately recognize the magical and sinister nature of this abundance. These impossible spreads of food bring to mind still life paintings of the Dutch Golden Age. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, the Dutch Republic achieved independence from Spanish rule, developing a booming international trade and experiencing huge economic growth. As a result, exotic items and foodstuffs became more accessible and ushered in an era of conspicuous consumption. Recognizing this desire, artists began painting ostentatious still life scenes called Pronkstilleven, often depicting elaborate banquets of food, both nationalistic and exotic. In some ways, these paintings were better than the real thing. The food depicted would never rot, never be eaten, never cease to stand in for the wealth of its patron. The consumer culture illustrated in these paintings has been compared to Instagram foodie accounts today. People still recognize the ways the allure of food may stand in for the allure of the one paying for it. While these paintings could showcase an ever-fresh abundance, they also came with moralistic undertones of memento mori and vanitas. This opulence served as a reminder that nothing good can stay, not even the audience. The threat of death encouraged viewers to act righteously in life, so they may get into heaven. These paintings could warn against excess, even in celebrating it. Clara Peters painted stacks of cheese and butter in reference to the Dutch phrase translating to "dairy on dairy is the work of the devil." The bouquets painted by Dutch artists were impressive in their time for being impossible, bringing together in paint beautiful flowers which could never bloom simultaneously in the real world. Like the food on the witch's table, in a pre-globalized world, we must recognize this abundance and beauty as a fantasy. That fantasy made real may then either be a miracle or a revelation of something sinister. Later, returning to the cellar once again, Gretel watches the witch magically transform body parts into a feast, an act which inspires disgust as it reveals to us the true nature of the foods the children have been eating. This theme, revealing something attractive to, in fact, be disgusting, can be found elsewhere in fairy tales. Perhaps more horrifying than the possibility of being eaten is the possibility of unknowingly eating someone else, being manipulated or misled into committing this taboo act. The Juniper Tree, another tale published by the Brothers Grimm, tells the story of yet another evil stepmother killing her stepson and serving him to his father and stepsister. Cannibalism is personal. To be tricked into cannibalism requires one to admit that the flesh of a human being was made appetizing to them. Again, we return to the shameful deceit of fairy glamour. Cannibalism, by trickery, perverts the pleasure of food. No matter how beautiful or tasty a meal of human flesh may be, once its origins are revealed to us, we are disgusted, not only with the meal, but with ourselves. The revelation of the true nature of the thing is its cost. As with Eve's fruit from the tree of knowledge, the cost of knowing is the inability to continue to gain pleasure from a limited perspective. But is that cost worth it?
Ignorance is bliss.
When the witch dumps the body parts, human meat, we see this heart roll to the edge of the table. In the Pronksteleven tradition, an artist would place food or dishware by the ledge of a table as another memento mori symbol to communicate the precarious nature of life. The heart transforms into a shiny red apple, the archetypical forbidden food. Meat and other rich foods are forbidden to practicing Catholics during the fasting period of Lent, and so in Dutch still life, meat is sometimes a symbol of gluttony. Its transformation here once again invites us to interpret this story through a Christian lens. Jesus came back into the world, placed in a manger, a food trough for livestock. He's referred to as the Lamb of God, intended for sacrifice. Through connecting to Christian motifs, the theme of cannibalism is reinforced. A connection can even be drawn between this scene of cannibalistic transmogrification to the Catholic tradition of the Eucharist, a sacrament in which bread and wine are literally transfigured into the flesh and blood of Christ. In this religious ritual, the food is no longer forbidden, but divine. So, if fairy tales are preoccupied with the sacred and dangerous function of food, they come by it honestly. For better or for worse, we understand that food, though seemingly mundane, holds an inherent power that cannot be discounted. The power, magical or otherwise, necessary to conjure pleasure, comes at a cost, and that cost determines whether that power is miraculous or ominous. In film, feasting may serve to indicate a number of themes to an audience.
And when they went to the queen to tell her her subjects had no bread, do you know what she said?
Let them eat cake.
We are delighted by presentations of wealth, but condemn the waste it must inherently generate.
Try one of these. They are divine.
No, I can't eat another thing. Here.
It makes you sick. so you can go on eating.
How else could you taste everything?
This is the reality revealed underneath the fairy glamour. Feasting may inspire disgust. The sin of gluttony being so closely associated with real bodily discomfort. Perhaps we find it easier to be suspicious or critical of feasting today, since we are all more well acquainted with the feeling of being overfed.
Oh, fuck off, I'm full.
So what is the significance of Gretel and Hansel in the context of a globalized food market where almost all of what we eat appears as if by magic? Their feast is our reality. And it's not just food. Most of the things that make up our daily life that we take for granted is magical in some way. Now, by no means do I think this film is arguing that we should all go live off the land, but it does invite us to look at our consumption through a critical lens.
The average item of food in America has traveled 1,500 miles from the farm to your plate. It's burned up an incredible amount of fossil fuel just to get there. A lot of the energy in our food comes from processing. All the complicated steps needed to make a Twinkie, all use vast amounts of energy.
In the original Hansel and Gretel story, a factor not included in this film, the children sacrifice some of their little provisions to leave a trail of breadcrumbs which they hope to follow back home. But it is eaten by birds, leaving them stranded. The possible metaphorical implications of this are wide-ranging. Again, we return to food. Bread is the simplest of foods, the prototype of food itself. But here, food is proven to be fallible, a finite resource which cannot be relied upon. The greater problem of the breadcrumbs, however, is that even if the children were able to follow the trail home, they would be returning to the same circumstances which forced them to leave. They would return to die. They cannot truly achieve safety without first finding a solution to their larger condition, not simply returning from their abandonment, which was necessitated by their poverty. Remembering the breadcrumbs may offer us a way of thinking through our circumstances. In an age of abundance, perhaps we must now turn to simplicity for security.
Colleen and her husband spend 6 to 8 hours a day stockpiling enough food and water to last them for years.
At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, people were scrambling for shelf-stable staples, as fears of disruptions to our globalized food system seemed like a distinct possibility.
Under a doomsday scenario, I'll be the only one standing there who has another 100 pounds to lose. Everybody else will be skin and bones.
At the end of Gretel and Hansel, Gretel takes the place of the witch, but it is ambiguous whether she will be able to use her power as a force for good, learning from the sacrifices of her teacher as to what it costs.
All that is left is to make him delicious.
The killing of the witch offers the opportunity for a new way of living, which may offer less easy pleasure, but is ultimately more fulfilling and ethical. We have overcome the problem of scarcity that is so key to fairy tale lore. In its place, we are left with the problem of ethical abundance.
What's all? I want fat, 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 rows of fat, flesh and more flesh, soft, undulating, quivering, jiggling mountains of young boy flesh. I grew weak with happiness at the very thought of it.